Hi, welcome to Winepilot.com. My name is Angus. Today we are very excited because we are going to have a chat about the wines from Orlando. Now, Orlando is an incredibly historic Australian wine company, founded in 1874 by the Gramps family. And in that time, really, they've put down some legendary Australian wines, things like the Steingarten Riesling. Also, you've got the Lawson's Padthaway Shiraz, Centenary Hill Barossa Shiraz, Lyndale Chardonnay, just some wines that have, I think some of us have, well, actually probably all of us have really grown up with as being really iconic Australian wines, South Australian wines, and really showcased, I think, the best that South Australia can do from a range of regions. And I think that's really a core of what Orlando does, is that it draws in great fruit from a whole range of regions. Today, we are joined by a number of very special people. First of whom is Ben Thoman, who is Chief Winemaker of Orlando. Ben, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It is an absolute pleasure. We have Jeni Port, a long-standing wine writer for The Age, joining us from Melbourne. Hello, Jeni.
Hello.
Tony Love, joining from the Adelaide Hills. Hello, Tony. And Shanteh.
Howdy, everybody.
Thanks, Tony. And last week, but not least, is obviously Shantae Wong, head sommelier at Key Restaurant.
Hello.
So, Ben, we'll start with you. I understand you're an Adelaide Hills boy, so you grew up in the centre of wine, or one of the centres of wine. But wine wasn't your first career choice, was it?
No, I was an engineer for 10 years before being a winemaker. So straight out of school, went to university, did my degree in engineering, did that for about a decade, and then just sort of had that feeling in my early 30s that maybe I wanted to do something a little bit different. Went back to university, Adelaide Uni at Wake campus, and did winemaking. And 10 years later, I'm still in the wine industry, so I'm really loving it too.
Lovely. And so you're at Orlando now, but you've been within the whole business for a while, essentially.
Yeah, so I've been working with Pernod Ricard now, actually coming up to a decade, to 10 years next vintage, working across a variety of the brands, whether Jacobs Creek and St. Hugo, but now really focusing on Orlando.
Lovely. And how long within Orlando? How long have you been before you were, I guess, chief winemaker? Were you concentrating on the Orlando wines?
Well, we've been making a few wines in the Orlando range, like Jacaranda Origin, Coonawarra Cabernet, and Lawson's Padthaway Shiraz for the entire time that I've been with Pernod. So, but we're just, I guess, bringing back some of those other famous names back into the Orlando stable and bringing in a few new wines. So I've had a finger in that pie for pretty much the whole time, but now we're really putting all that focus back into the brand.
Lovely. I mean, Tony, I think, we talked about this earlier. You've got a significant history, I guess, looking at these wines. I mean, for you personally, what does Orlando mean for you?
Look, Orlando is one of those brands and one of those names that really just resonates if you've been, interested in wine for, decades, and that might be me. But, it's the name that has sort of been across the Great Arch at Tanunda. It's, as you enter the township, it's, I was only just a couple of days ago down in Victor Harbour, and there's this, on one of the old buildings down there's this fantastic old sign. It must be sort of 2 stories high almost, this building, and it's about half of the height. And so, it's just one of those names that everywhere you go, it's part of your zeitgeist in terms of wine culture, and certainly, from the Barossa Valley and from the history of South Australian wine. And of course, I was also, I remember as a young fella, we had Barossa Pearl, the great old Barossa Pearl in our house, usually on Sunday for Sunday lunch. I recall that probably being part of the thing that we had. I was brought up on Barossa Sect as a house sparkling, and I guess in the 50s and 60s, Barossa Pearl was an extension of that. I think every household who drank wine, had Barossa Pearl in their house. And so, it's just one of those things that is part of the way we live. And I think also because of those great old, sort of brands the names of those labels and the names of those wines from the Coonawarra and from Padthaway, they stretch your horizons in terms of some of the great and well-regarded regions. They've been there the whole time, and they're the ones we tasted and they're the ones we learned about. So it's been a really important, name for us and wine to drink over decades and decades.
And if you were to pick out like a favourite, you know, an Orlando wine that has the greatest resonance for you, would it be Barossa Pearl?
Well, it would be, well, I mean, in terms of my memory bank, it would be Barossa Pearl. But I think in terms of my my palate bank, it would be Steingarten for one, and also Jacaranda Ridge Cabernet the other. So if you wanted to sort of have the two ends of the spectrum in terms of the Orlando wines over the years, they would be the ones that have that I recall and have loved, you know, more than anything.
Lovely. And Jeni, for you, I mean, what has Orlando meant for you personally?
Personally, I think it's the reason why I'm here in front of you. It's Barossa Pearl. It's the wine that I tasted very young, and it's the wine that resonated the most. And it's what I loved about wine, and why eventually I became a wine writer. It's probably not a story that Wine Australia would like to hear, but as a 9-year-old, I would stay with my aunt, who had no children, I might add, had no idea how to raise children, but every now and again I would, I don't know, once a month, twice a month, I'd have a weekend with her, and she would open Barossa Pearl, and I would share a fair amount of it, is my memory. And I just love that taste. It was grapes. It was just fresh and clean and grapey. And for a 9-year-old, that was pretty damn exciting, I've got to say.
But also like I mean, it's a vital wine that's clearly got a lot of people into wine, isn't it? Like it really is a vital moment in Australian wine in some ways.
Well, in fact, I was looking up a little bit of history, and Gunter Pruss, who was the managing director for a very long time, very famous wine name in Australian wine history, said that, and it was launched during the Melbourne Olympics too. It was made to celebrate with all the visitors coming over to Melbourne for the 56 Olympics. And he said that, to his memory, it did more than any other table wine to establish wine as an integral part of our society. And I think he was right. And he gave up counting after 10 million bottles. They reached 10 million bottles so quickly that they simply gave up counting, because 1 million bottles was happening like that all the time. And it lasted about 3 decades. So it was very, very important, not just for me, but for so many drinkers of my generation, Tony's generation, set us on the path to being a wine drinking nation, moving away from beer.
I was just about to say that, Jeni. I mean, it was right at that cusp. It was the transition from long neck bottles of beer at the dinner table, in our family certainly, and certainly probably amongst people that we knew, into a long neck bottle of sparkling wine. And that then, you know, probably established the bridgehead into wine culture rather than beer culture. So it really, I mean, probably if you culturally looked at it in that way, it was incredibly important. And
because the 50s are also when you get the post-World War II immigration into Australia. You're getting the Greeks and the Italians, and they are changing the way we are eating and drinking. It happened in a very synergistic way, I think. All around the same time.
And just as a little sidelight, I found in my kitchen a couple of weeks ago, or a month or so ago, was just sitting in the back of in a corner, was this wine. Now, I know it's probably looking backwards to you. It's Star Wine, Sparkling Star Wine Orlando. And Ben and I did a bit of a
Can you put it closer? Because we can't quite see, Tony. Can you put it right up against the camera?
Right up. Okay, so you've got this amazing, beautiful label, which is the reason we kept it. Was this label, you know, this beautiful starlit sky, little Barossan village, church steeples, etc., that sort of thing. And Ben did a little bit of a research on that. We were talking about it, and so Colin Gramp was saying that this was a step up in level in quality from Barossa Pearl. So a couple of years after Barossa Pearl of 56, this Star Wine came on to they started making Star Wine in 58, and they had to introduce some new technology. Ben, I think you were looking at that, weren't you? I think
I just found an interview just serendipitously with Colin that was in the library archives. And he was just, I guess he was just trying to create a wine that was that stepping stone for people that had been drinking Pearl for a while, but wanted to move up a little bit. So that's why they introduced Star Wine.
And
So
I think
like
the
a
technology...
dry style, was it?
Well, I'm not entirely, I think it was still sweet, but
Yeah.
obviously I haven't tried it, so it's hard to it's hard for me to gauge. But I believe it should have been a bit drier. I suspect it was slightly higher quality fruit, but yeah.
And I think the thing was that the technology that they developed to make this next level up kind of was an inspiration for the technology that then they went into making Riesling. They learned about the cooling aspects in the winery. So I think so it was only 4 years after they started making Star Wine that they planted the Steingarten vineyard and they started being serious about making super crisp, beautiful, clean Riesling, which was a real the next breakthrough, I think. In that history and in the wine culture from Orlando.
So talking about Steingarten, I mean, Shanteh and I are from slightly different generations, I guess. Orlando means a little bit different to us, I would suggest. Not that we didn't drink sweet wine, but I mean, Shanteh, for you personally, and not in and out of the restaurant scene, how do you see, things like Jacaranda Ridge and Steingarten? How do they, for your customers, how do they see it?
It's interesting. I actually spoke to my parents and actually my in-laws, and I'd come across Steingarten a couple of times throughout my career and seen it on a few kind of wine lists where they had a bit of vintage depth. So Steingarten for me was something that I had some attachment to, but I was surprised, very pleasantly surprised by chatting to quite a few people just how much the Orlando name just rolled off their tongue, and they were like, oh gosh, that brings me back. So much attachment to it, and re-experiencing these wines, I really get a sense of an Aussie spirit about them, and Jacaranda Ridge in particular reminds me of some of the wines that I first fell in love with when I was getting into wine and then I was tasting out of my father's cellar. So I think they've done an amazing job of really encapsulating what the spirit of Orlando is all about, but also moving forward with their new heroes range is very impressive.
I think for me personally, I think Steingarten, you could never find it. It was the only problem with Steingarten, because obviously for a long time it was the single vineyard wine. Maybe it all went to South Australia and Melbourne, but literally you could not, and I wasn't going to many posh restaurants, but you literally could not find it. It was so incredibly hard to find, and so finding a bottle of Steingarten sitting in the back of a wine shop was a bit of it was like you'd found hidden treasure. And often they had a couple of years on them, and Shanteh, I think the same. My experience mirrors yours in some ways. Is I had heard a lot about them, and they did live up to their expectations that I have of them as well. And Jacaranda Ridge as well. I think that as well. It's a classic Coonawarra style, but it's done. I think very, very well. So in terms of those legendary wines, we've all tasted some of those wines recently. I mean, Ben, when you've got your hands on these golden oldies, so to speak, I mean, how do you feel about that? Is that, do you feel like you're carrying a legacy?
Absolutely, there's a bit of pressure there as well, because I mean, it's a very much loved brand, not only through Australia and South Australia, but in the Barossa, that name's been around since the Grant family's obviously been around since 1847 when they planted their first vines there, and has established that long tradition of employing locals and the likes. There's a great love for the brand, and obviously we want to do well by the brand and take it into the future and really look after it and nurture it. So there's a bit of pressure there, but it's also a great challenge and super exciting to be involved and help it evolve a little bit to stay modern to a degree, but still paying respect to the past.
Yeah. And Jeni, that 910 Steingarten Riesling, how did you see that particular wine?
Well, it's one of my favorites. And I think that's often, it can be a plus or a minus. You see the name, you've been drinking it for decades. There are expectations that come with that, I think. And I think from that point of view, it was resolved when those expectations were met. It's still young though. I don't know whether Orlando would like to do some more museum releases, but I tasted it and I would certainly enjoy it now, but the potential was so much greater, I think, with that wine. Now my notes were a masterclass in what we perceive as minerality, that tang of stone or flint or slate, which is expressive aromatically and texturally. I think maybe we can talk a bit more about that, because so many people don't believe in mineral characters in wine. So I'd like Ben's opinion on that. But for me, it's there, and it's always there in Steingarten. And when you go to the vineyard, you can't help but make that visual connection too, with so many rocks and stones. It is a hard place and a high place. So you're getting those cool climate characters coming through. And that is in that kind of lime cordial intensity, apple blossom, the honeysuckle, the prettiest florals on this wine. And again, for a 19, to see those coming through beautifully is a joy. Because for so many young Rieslings, all these things are just nice and, you know, tight and coiled. These are still nicely expressed as a young Riesling, which is why you could drink it now. But certainly the potential there is great.
I agree. Sometimes you see those Eden ones and they're just so tight.
So tight.
They're so
and the acid isn't that hard either. There's such a thing as, like, I call it soft acid, and it's not cutting you on the back of the throat. That's got that softness to me, and it's definitely there. Acid is part of the key to Steingarten and that cooler climate style, but it's a soft acid for me. But I would welcome Ben's idea on minerality. Come on, Ben.
Been thrown in the fire now, Ben.
Tell me I'm lying. Come on.
There's certainly some controversy about whether, you know, there is minerality in wine, or what is minerality. But I think if you look at some of the German Rieslings out of the Mosel, where they're growing on those amazing hills that are just slate, and they do seem to take on the flavour. In our minds, we think it is the stone. I think it might be something to do with the leanness of the soils, and the canopies in the vineyard aren't particularly big. They're not big, vigorous vines. There's that acidity that you're talking about. Try to get the acidity without the phenolic, so that it is that soft acidity you're talking about. And for me, that's where the minerality comes in. It's like a fineness, the focus of the acidity. And I think that's definitely got something to do with the soil. And I think it's probably to do with like the leaner soils that don't have a lot of nitrogen in them, and just producing a really well balanced vine for the Riesling of that style. And it's about balance. And just, making sure you get the acidity without the phenolic character. And obviously acidity and phenolics play off against each other and exacerbate each other. So you get that hardness of acid, which is not particularly pleasant. And that's what we're aiming for in Steingarten, is the fineness of the acidity.
I think for me, with that wine, just screamed of food. It just screamed like I wanted to eat something with it. I mean, Shanteh, did you see that as a good food style?
Oh, absolutely. And I think, I think in terms of that wine, I'm so glad you brought up the acidity, because so often, other than acid junkies and people that are Riesling freaks, you do get a lot of guests that come in and perhaps want to go to a slightly different varietal because they don't want to stay on Riesling for so long. And that is just a wine that was so pure that you could happily have another bottle after another bottle all throughout the meal. But I mean, seafood, we always talk about seafood, but I think lots of different vegetables would work with that. Lots of kind of nice, kind of fresh, vibrant herbs, fresh cheeses. That could have an array of things that would work particularly well with it. And you're right, I think on its own too, the fineness of the acidity just means that you want to have another glass after another, if you can.
Tony?
Yeah, to me, I love this sort of discussion about minerality and the mouthfeel. I've always associated that sort of that talky, chalky minerality kind of thing. I've always had the impression that it's kind of like the pith of citrus fruits. So I always sort of associate the lemon, the lime, the grapefruit, whatever it might be, even Granny Smith apples, that sort of pithiness that you get in the mouth, which is a feel. Is it minerality? Is it pithiness? It's all those things. To me, it's part of the whole makeup of the wine. Do we try and dissect it? Yes, that's what we do. But in terms of a total drink, it all kind of comes together. You have that sort of that orchard blossom to begin with, which is so classically Eden Valley. and you get that sort of, and then you get that sort of lemon lime thing. And every year that's going to be in every kind of different house style. That's going to be a different kind of, sort of flavour, sort of leaning one way or the other. For me, this was much more a lemon lip smack of lemon. And then you get that pithiness and as we sort of, call it, minerality. And to me, it's just this total wine that expresses Eden Valley. And, if you want to know, and I guess Steingarten's been that for many, many years. It really has been that ambassador for Eden Valley Riesling for many, many years. And it's just great to see that it's still doing that. And I mean, I put it down to my notes just say, I'd like, this is going to be shining brightly at least for another 10 years, in 10 years' time. I have a few little Rieslings in my my home cellar that are 10 years and 20 years. And sometimes I even find things that are 30 years old, amazingly. And they're just amazing wines. And they're just really an Australian icon for me. And I just loved it. And it's a really special moment to drink Steingarten. Jeni and I had the pleasure, gosh, I think it was probably 8 years ago, maybe 7 years ago.
Maybe a bit more.
Yeah, and we did a museum tasting of Steingartens, and they were just unbelievable. And my recollection still is 2002 just stood out as an amazing wine. I think the current vintage when we did it was 2012. I'm not sure now. And my archives don't go back. Notes don't go well back in that sort of way. But it just augurs well for a fabulous future. And if we can just convince thousands and thousands of people to drink Riesling and drink older Riesling as well, and understand that white wine ages like this wine, the world will be a better place.
So Ben, we'll now turn to the Lyndale Chardonnay, the Orlando Lyndale Chardonnay, so 2018. I mean, Adelaide Hills Chardonnay, it's a pretty competitive spot, isn't it? There's some pretty good wines you're up against.
Absolutely, it's good, and it's great to see sort of that competition. I guess it breeds quality, just sort of self-perpetuates in a way that everyone's really chasing the next great vintage of their wine that they're making. So it's good to see that there are a lot of people out there leaving their charge. If you do any wine shows testing through the Chardonnay brackets of Australian Chardonnay these days, not just Adelaide Hills, it's just some absolutely cracking examples coming out, whether it be West Australia or into Victoria, but South Australia as well is doing a great job. So it's a really exciting space, I guess, to be making wine in. Come a long way from those buttery days of stacks of American oak, and it's really nice.
I mean, everything had was thrown at that wine, though, wasn't it? I assume wild yeast and barrel ferment and bit of lee stirring, and I mean,
whole bunch pressing and did some whole bunch. In fact, the most of it's whole bunch pressed, chilled overnight, pressed, starting ferment in barrel, and then finishing it off in barrel with a little bit of solids in there as well, just trying to create those layers, some complexity, but without going over the top. I mean, I love a bit of sulphide in that matching sulphide in my Chardonnays, but you want it to be one of the layers, not the dominating characteristic. And I think with the Lyndale, with the 18, we managed to just to get it in there at about the right level so that it's present, but it's not overpowering.
So Shanteh, you've got a cracking Chardonnay list at Key, where a wine like this, does it sit comfortably within that?
Yeah, definitely. I think there's so much consideration in the whole range, especially when it comes to texture. There's so many elements that I had in my notes of yogurt and creme fraiche and bitter almond kind of notes. But like I said, I love that little hint of flinty notes, but it's just there, and then it's still quite generous as well in terms of a moderate kind of body on the palate. So I think it ticks all the boxes for Chardonnay drinkers. I just thought this wine just screamed having fish and chips with some like nice malt vinegar on your chips. I just thought that would be absolutely delicious, and I was a bit sad that I didn't have that at the time I was drinking it. But I think a Chardonnay that definitely would please a lot of different styles of Chardonnay drinkers.
Yeah, it had a general. I mean, I think Chardonnay should always have a generosity, and this wine definitely had that kind of generosity. Jeni, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm just trying to go back over. I've written mineral tang. How's that? This mineral thing just keeps on going. I like that crunchiness. It had a lovely crunchy counter character to me. Excuse me, I'm going to cough. And I thought it was true to its origins. So I think with Adelaide Hill Chardonnay, we have expectations. The minute you see that on the label, it's a bit like the Steingarten, your expectations are there. And I thought it was a strong regional definition of the grape, those white peach fruits, well-defined natural acidity. It was all there. Loved it.
Yep.
So now we'll move on to the red wines. We'll move on to the Lawson. So it's a 2015 vintage. So Orlando, Padthaway, Shiraz. And I mean, something that I really love about Orlando is that they stuck with wines like this, I think, because there's a lot of kind of, Padthaway makes a lot of really lovely wines and very few people put it on the label for whatever reason. Whereas I think, as this wine shows, it absolutely has a place among South Australia's, I think, top Shiraz regions. I mean, Tony, you've drunk a bit of South Australian Shiraz. Where do you see Padthaway sitting, and stylistically as well?
It's interesting, isn't it? Padthaway is, has, I don't know, it's always had that kind of backbone to a lot of great wines in South Australia, and not necessarily recognised for that. I mean, it sort of has always fallen in a bit of a shadow to Coonawarra, which is just south of there, in the sense of the fame of the region. But it is medium to cool in a sense. It's got there are pockets of it, because it's pretty flat, but there are pockets of it that are sort of quite cool, and I just think that the wines there have been hidden from sight in a sense, in terms of some of the big labels. So it's great to see that something like Lawson's can stay there and be celebrated for what Padthaway is about. Whenever I drive from my place to Coonawarra, there's always just that thing where it's like the gateway to the southeast in a sense. When you drive through there, there's just beautiful country to the east of it, hills going up. You've got beautiful flat land and rich flat land, which just makes fantastic Shiraz. And this is the kind of wine that is there all the time in our again, like the Orlando kind of brand. Padthaway wines are there, and we see them, and you kind of they're just part of the zeitgeist, I guess, in a sense. It's great to see that there's a richness to them, but a definition to the wine as well, which I think is really important.
And a savouriness. It's not just sweet fruit. There's this meaty, savoury edge, I think, and especially with a bit of age, as this wine clearly has. I mean, Jeni, how did you find this wine?
This is another one of those interesting wines where, again, I'd like some input from Ben about it. It's that pepperminty, bushmint, eucalypt, Aussie bush, whatever character you want to describe it as. This wine has it. To me, it's nicely countered by the fruit, but you can see it there. I would like to know how this would go in a wine show, actually, because I think this is one of those controversial wines that you would get some judges going, is that too much mint? Is that too much eucalypt? And I think the fruit is up to it, as I said, but certainly amongst that black blueberry fruits, mulberries, there is that bush mint. So Ben, what's your take on how you approach that in your winemaking?
That's been a part of this style ever since we started first producing it in the early 80s. So I think it's one of those things that, there's a lot of people that love this wine, and we just don't want to change it too much from that. It does, I think you're really right there, it's polarising in wine shows. But the 15 did take out the top gold at the 2020 Adelaide wine show for the 15 and older Shiraz class. So there are wine judges that love it, drinkers like me that love it as well. But it's a really unique site. It's got a tea trellis, which is pretty unusual for vineyards in South Australia producing wine grapes. It is surrounded by eucalypts. It's on the eastern side, as Tony was talking about. You're just sort of heading up into those little small hills there in Padthaway. There's a little bit of Riesling and other white varieties that were accidentally planted in there. So I think it's a bit of the original field blend maybe before it became fashionable. And it's just a unique site that produces a wine very consistent year in, year out. When we do the museum tastings on this wine every year, we just see that same character really flowing through. And so it really does have a sense of place. I guess for the whole Orlando range, except for this wine, we will change the vineyards from time to time, depending on the vintage, trying to make the best wine of that style every year. But we will never change the vineyard sourcing for Lawson's, because it's all about that site, really.
It's a very unique wine and a wine style. Don't you think, Shanteh? I mean, in terms of is there a place for this kind of style of wine? Because it's a savoury and earthy kind of style. Fair bit of oak. No, we haven't mentioned it, but this wine was fairly oaky too. Do you get many clients who are after this kind of style?
Absolutely, absolutely, you do. And I think particularly the Legends range, you know, I've kept a couple of Coravin bottles to share with the team. I think it's really important that they see these kind of styles and appreciate what they're all about. Whether or not I would see it in a wine show and know where this wine was from, when I tasted it, I kind of looked back at the label and thought, Padthaway. And all I remember from my time there was the incredible gum trees, the just huge towering gums. And when I looked at that and then I saw that, like we said, and I think you've put it really well, Jeni, that bit of, I would say, just bush mint kind of element, I thought it really spitted well within the wine, but there was plenty of fruit and plenty of savoury olive and other tones in there, I think, that made the wine very interesting. Definitely a style, but that's what we want to see on wine lists. We want to see lots of different styles of lots of different regions in Australia.
Yeah. I mean, talking about a style, we'll then move on to the Orlando Centenary Hill Barossa Shiraz. You know, Barossa, obviously, you know, the home of many of Australia's greatest wines, and this is, I guess, Orlando's shot at the title in some ways. Ben, how do you make a Barossa Shiraz to stand out when there's so much competition around?
Yeah, look, I guess Centenary Hill is one of those wines. Again, it's another one we've been making for a while, so there's a bit of a style to it. We do use a bit of American oak in there in this wine, so you can see that sort of coconutty character coming through, which is a bit of a nod to the past of Barossa, where a lot of American oak was used with a fair bit of vigour. But we do source all the fruit from a specific site around Jacobs Creek, very close to, you know, where the Grant family originally planted their first vines. So it's quite a sort of southern Barossa style, sub-regional style, maybe central southern, depending on where you sort of draw that boundary. But again, sort of similar to Lawson's, it does have that sense of place. We've got some vines that go into this that are, you know, pushing 100 years old now, so there's a lot of that old vine character in there as well. And just trying to keep it from that same place, similar winemaking styles, but also this is one of the wines that I guess we're evolving a little bit to try to keep up with the fashion and the times and keep it modern. There's a bit of whole bunch in this one, but, you know, not too much. We don't want it to stand out. We just want it to be another one of those layers and complexing characters in the wine.
Tony, love a bit of American oak, I imagine?
Well, you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because some of my tastings just in the last few weeks have actually have been with wines with American oak, or a combination of French and American oak. So the management of that it must be really interesting for you, Ben, in terms of not getting it so coconutty, vanilla-y, sweet elements into it, to keep it spiced rather than sweet spice, to find that kind of balance. And also, I'm fascinated by whole bunch in Barossa Shiraz, because I know there's people I've spoken to in Barossa, there's a bit of you know, discussion about whole bunch in Shiraz and how much works, whether or not it provides a sort of that, you know, that green stemminess that maybe not works in the generosity and sweetness of Barossa Shiraz. So what is the thinking from your side of things for that?
So I guess we've got a bit of a luxury in Orlando that we can put down a lot of different parcels. So we ferment those blocks out in several different fermenters, using some with zero whole bunch, and then we sort of push around 25% maximum. And then when we come to blending, that's when we start looking at those individual barrels and how many barrels of that 25% whole bunch should we actually introduce to the final blend. And it's a small blend, so we might just be taking one barrel, literally one barrel. Just trying to add a little bit of that spiciness, a bit of the stemmy tannin character as well, and a whole bunch. You get a little bit of Cabernet character, because it's obviously, you know, you try to keep those bunches as, you know, as whole as possible for as long as possible, but super gentle. But again, this is it's a nod to the past in this one. We don't want it to look super Cabernet-y like a lot of, you know, modern Australian wines are sort of taking those Beaujolais cues now. We want it to be, you know, to still look like Centenary Hill, but just with a little bit of a modern twist to it.
And is there a thing about Southern Barossa, Northern Barossa, in terms of you're tending to source from Jacobs Creek South for this wine, and then you've obviously got your other, your Prince Shed Northern Barossa from, sort of up there, Ebenezer and Grenache kind of way. I mean, is the fruit radically different?
I guess the more Barossa wines you taste, the more you see the differences. For me, the Southern Barossa really adds those peppery spice notes. I guess the cooler breezes coming through there. And then you look at the Northern Barossa, and I find the fruit is really quite dark, but the tannins are really they're almost sweet. They're soft and big and generous. Makes really big, juicy wines, whereas from down south, you get more of the peppery spice notes and those sort of things coming in.
So what was the proportion of whole bunch in there, in this wine in 2015, approximately?
Yeah, across the whole blend. Like, there's one component in there that had about 25%. We put in a couple of barrels. So, I mean, at the end of the day, it's only a few percent across that. But, it's, it's the sort of salt and pepper, I guess.
Yeah. Shanteh, at a restaurant, I mean, do you think that whole bunch character in Barossa Shiraz is something that restaurant goers are looking for?
I think that perhaps the more discerning drinkers want to see more complexity. However, I don't know if they'd articulate it like in that way. I certainly think on a list, this wine, people do ask for these styles. They want something that over delivers, that's so generous, and I think it's a beast of a wine, that's for sure. But that's very valid in terms of what people are asking for, and you need to have wines like this on your list, so when someone comes and you can get out the big decanters and really showcase something that just over delivers for what I think is the price point for this wine.
So the last wine of the legends that we're going to look at is 2015 Jacaranda Origin. I guess this is this is really the Orlando's classic red, in many ways. Jeni, Jacaranda Ridge, how do you think it sits in the with a generation of kind of newer people coming out? Where does Jacaranda Ridge sit these days?
I think it sits really well. I think it's a lovely contrast too. Excuse me, I'm going to cough again. I think it's hay fever season. That's why I've got it. I think it's a lovely contrast to the Padthaway too, that you've got a classic area, classic grape variety, doing it in a traditional kind of proprietorial way too. That again, people know what to expect. That's why they order it. That's why they buy it every year. And I think it's really important to maintain that it can't always be about trying new things, different things. It's about upholding standards and history. And that's what I like about wine. I like that connection to the past. And I think it's there very much in this Jacaranda Ridge. And I love the intensity of fruit coming through here. And for my way of thinking, a more sympathetic use of oak coming through in this wine. So you allow that blackcurrant, black olive, brine, chocolate, licorice, coffee grounds, all those yummy things to come through. It's complex. It is attention seeking. I love that opening. I've called it opening move. It's like, here I am, wham, and I'm going to suck you in. And it did it. Lovely wine.
Yeah, Coonawarra, loud and proud with its choc mint, violetsy aromas, but then sinewy palate. I thought that it was everything you'd expect. 2015 vintage, still nice and youthful. Tony, your thoughts?
For me, this is a really interesting wine because I think that it speaks so much. It's got so much history and tradition to uphold. So it's interesting to sort of see a wine that's, a new release, contemporary wine, but also having that history in it. And I think it's a really important thing. It's interesting reading back on your own notes and everything. I said this is the wine equivalent of an exhibition of great Australian landscapes like Streeton, Roberts, and McCubbin. It's like going to visit an art gallery and seeing some of the classic paintings. This is one of those wines that is exactly like that. It just speaks of the landscape, and as Jeni said, you know, the region, the classic variety that marries together. Interestingly, just my thoughts on that mint eucalyptus, you know, argument again. For me, this was dark chalk mint rather than green eucalyptus mint kind of feels. So for that, I mean, I you know, that's a classic. You know, that's the good side of mint, if you want to sort of say that, in terms of the drinking capacity. So I think, and also again, we go back to the acidity. I thought the acidity in this wine, with all that power, there was just this beautiful, fresh, still, you know, 5 years old, just had this plenty of acidity driving its line and length. So it was to me, it was a solid wine. I really enjoyed it. Have enjoyed it for years. Great to see that it's still, you know, right up there on the mark.
I roasted the lamb for this particular wine. I went and after I tasted it, I went and roasted the lamb afterwards. And because I think lamb and Coonawarra is just a cracking mix, and it did go beautifully well. And I think, I mean, Jeni, I think the sympathetic use of oak, I think, is a very good point with this particular wine, which makes it potentially a more food-friendly style. Would you agree with that, Shanteh?
Yeah, absolutely. I did notice the use of oak, and I thought, no, this makes a lot of sense for this wine. It's got so much nostalgia, and I absolutely love that about this wine. And I totally agree. I'm just still reeling how Tony put that so poetically in reference to Australian artwork. But I think that there is so much generous fruit, and that the mint isn't eucalypt. It's not that kind of harsh, almost tea tree eucalypt kind of note. It's more of a wintergreen and that chalk peppermint patty note, which I really enjoy.
So Orlando have these legends, these wines that they've done for decades, and they're really what, you know, many people, I guess, think of when they think of Orlando. But then there's we obviously sense that there's an impetus for change within Orlando that's done what it's done very well, but it needs to move on at the same time. So this is the release of these new heroes wines. I guess what's the philosophy behind them? What are you trying to achieve with them?
I guess we're just trying to seek new palates in a way. There's a lot of people who probably started out having their first fine wines as Orlando or one of the other big names. And, you know, probably my age or a bit older now. So, you know, there's a lot of younger drinkers out there, and they're often following what is more fashionable, and why wouldn't you? So I guess we're trying to bring in some wines that are not only fashionable, they're more accessible in terms of price point. They're sub-regional. We're trying to, as Tony mentioned before, we've got a Northern Barossa Shiraz there. So just trying to show off sub-regions. We'll probably look to the future having some what might be dubbed alternate varieties and those sort of things in there. We've started out with 4 wines to begin with, but this will be the more dynamic part of the range. We might swap wines in and out, and the range will grow as the vintages come.
And I guess you don't have that history, that monkey on your shoulder with these particular wines. Like, essentially, you and your winemakers can decide how you want to define the style in many ways. That must be a nice, exciting project to be a part of.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can experiment a bit, and it doesn't always have to end up as being a wine in the Orlando range. But yeah, that's, I guess, one of the great things about working for Orlando is we have that latitude to I guess make mistakes and get in there and try new things. And if it doesn't work out, well, you know, try again next year. And
we were talking 2 to 4 weeks ago, and you're saying, you know, like alternative varieties. So like Tempranillo you're looking at or thinking about at least? Absolutely, yeah. So Tempranillo, and maybe some Grenache Veltliner or one of those other white varieties that are getting pretty popular at the moment. Lovely. Well, to start with, we have the 2019 Hillary Chardonnay, I should say, which I have right in front of me. And this was definitely one of my favourites in the range. I just thought it was beautifully pitched. I think with Chardonnay, some of those other techniques, you know, they're not cheap to do, essentially. Whereas I think, and because of that, it means sometimes winemakers kind of cut corners. But I saw that this wine really had lovely oak, which was very restrained, had some nice barrel ferment there, some, you know, bit of flintiness there. It had a lot of the other things that Lyndale had, that the top end Orlando had. Just the fruit was just a bit more laid back and a bit riper and a bit more generous. And I thought it was really well pitched for a consumer who likes Chardonnay, but maybe not into the super lean kind of modern stuff. But it's kind of a midway in that. Tony,
Absolutely.
what did your thought?
I mean, I note that it's 90% Piccadilly Valley, which is just over behind my back here by about a kilometre or so. And so I do have an affinity with wines from this part of the world. And it's got all that. It's got the classic white stone fruits that you see from the hills and Piccadilly Valley. My notes really, again, about clever oak management and the fact that you've got that sort of white stone fruit and you've got that little tweak and little squeeze of citrus, lemony sort of stuff that goes with it. I kind of always quite often describe it as, white stone fruits with someone just squeezing a bit of lemon over the top of it. And I did note there's a lovely creaminess to it, a nutty creaminess to it. Nothing was overworked here. So that's why I really like this wine. I mean, you see so many Chardonnays that have just been given the full, everything gets turned up to volume 11 and you lose the sense of what the fruit is. This doesn't have that. This has a really lovely drinkability, keeps its varietal shape and flavour spectrum. And I also noted, don't drink this too cold. I think I started tasting this when it was really cold. And I found that the acidity was accentuated by that. So I let it warm up a little bit and come to room temperature, closer to room temperature. And I found that then the fruit was able to come up a little bit more. And I just wanted to see the best expression of that wine. So I really love that wine, and it spoke to me exactly of what it should be.
Having just retasted that wine, the length was fantastic. I didn't really see that, I think, first, but it just lingers beautifully. Like it shows some concentrated fruit from a good region such as Piccadilly. Jeni from Victoria, and obviously one of Australia's great winemaking states when it comes to Chardonnay. How does the Victorian palate see this wine?
Victorian palate saw all of those things, but I zeroed in on the creaminess, the textural component. And again, I've got a question for Ben in particular. I think this is this new modern kind of character that Australian producers in particular have been looking at developing in their Chardonnay and their Riesling and other white varieties. Only over the last 10, 15 years, they have worked very, very hard on looking at their textural components of their whites, something that Australian white wine producers never really kind of participated in. This is a more European sensibility, I think, coming through. So Ben, how do you get that delicious creaminess in that wine?
I think it's a combination of leaving the wine on lees for an extended period of time and a bit of batonnage, so a bit of barrel stirring, but not too much. You don't want to overwork the wine and oxidize it. You just want to keep gently lifting those lees back up. So as the yeast breaks down, it releases compounds that attribute to that creaminess. But it's also, I think, about oak. So we use the 1 or 2 year oak predominantly in this and large format puncheon. So just bringing in a little bit of those oak tannins, but not too much so that you get the astringency. It just adds a bit of layering to that creaminess as well. So the combination of the oak tannin as well as the breaking down of the yeast, that autolysis character in there as well. I think it's those two really, but you need a really nice acid structure as well to carry that creaminess. Otherwise it gets sort of broad and flabby. I think as Tony was saying, as it warms up, you start to see the acidity sort of starts to fade a bit, and some of those other flavours really kick in and show themselves off, and sort of they work in synergy with that acidity.
Shanteh, texture is what you want to see in Chardonnay, isn't it?
100%. You hit the nail on the head. It's very true. And I actually think the New Heroes range, in fact, all of the wines that I saw there, I thought that the consideration towards texture was just turned up that little bit more. And that's what I could see that line carried right through the range. I had a note on minerality with this wine too, more on the hints of kind of oyster shell, maybe a little bit of cucumber kind of element. I still thought it had generosity, but it had that lovely concentration of, slow ripening in Piccadilly Valley and all the cool climate elements. So a very smart wine.
I mean, talking about texture, Ben, are you looking to make food-friendly styles, and is texture a part of that, or is it just, general good winemaking these days is concentrating more on texture?
I think great wine and great food always go together no matter what, really. But I think, where our culture is going at the moment, food and wine, like drinking, is going to be more and more associated with the, meal time. So I think if you're not making wines to be consumed with food, then you're going to miss the boat, really. So absolutely, it's always a consideration.
Very well. The next wine we are going to look at is your Grenache. Now, I think we're all fairly big Grenache fans here. I would think we're all probably very excited about where Australian Grenache is and where it's going. I think. Ben, what's your take on making good Grenache and the style of Grenache that you're trying to show us here?
Well, Grenache is can be tricky, but it's also can be easy to make in a way. It's one of those varieties that you need to set the vineyard up well to start with, so that you can get the fruit ripe at a lowish Beaumet. When I say lowish for Grenache, you're probably looking at the Barossa around 13.5 to 14 Beaumet really is where you're going to need to get it to get the ripeness and get rid of the green characters. But it's one of those varieties that if the canopies are too big and there's too much fruit on there, you're going to be pushing out into 15, 16 Beaumet, and you're going to get a really porty Grenache. So getting the vineyard right, and then we like to play around a bit and do a lot of different ferments from the same blocks and do some whole bunch, some extended maceration. So one of the components that's gone into that Grenache has been on skins for about 70 days and as whole berries, so we didn't even crush them. Really split it up into lots of different parcels. So I like to call this the whole kitchen sink. We really threw everything at this one to try to make a wine that not only had those really bright sort of Turkish delight and raspberry flavours that are really enticing and super fashionable at the moment, people are loving, but it also has a serious side to it. That extended maceration's given it a nice tannin structure and drive on the palate, which I think will set this wine up to be one that will age quite well over the next decade or so.
Yeah, I really like you've got the sweetness, which is what you need to have, I think, with Grenache. But then you're right. I think that, that long maceration's just given a nice savoury edge to it. So when you're looking for more, it delivers, I think. And it's, very, it's rich like a good Grenache should be, but it's also got some delicacy in there as well. Jeni, your take on it?
I loved it. But then I'm loving that whole new wave of Grenache that's coming through. And I think what I'm really picking up is the fragrance and those aromatics. We haven't really seen them promoted before in Grenache. And I think they're just stunning. And in particular in this one, I picked up something I've called a dried raspberry. I found it quite a distinctive feature in this wine, along with that potpourri kind of sweet floral thing happening, but lots of plummy flavour too and spice. That light pepperiness, just a little theme kind of running through it. And again, Grenache can be so kind of chunky. And I thought those grainy tannins not only brought it nice and tight and to a lovely structure, but freshness. There was so much freshness to this wine. So it's all just there waiting for you to devour it, but with potential for a bit more aging as well. But loved it. And there's absolute gorgeous aromatics that just won me over.
Yeah, it's very user-friendly, and it immediately is just approachable and delicious, I think. Tony?
Yeah, everything that she said. And much to love about this wine. And the aromatics, of course, are the Grenache thing that that is very attractive. And I just love this this sort of layering of sweet fruit flavours, as we've all described them, as well as the sort of all the savoury elements like the herbal stuff and everything as well. And I mean, my notes basically say, look, it's got all that sort of herb garden, stones, crushed rocks, all those things that the French call garrigue. And I know that that's here. It's in this wine, and that's the lovable thing about Grenache for me, is I love seeing that. And every house has its own way of producing that. And that is the distinctive thing about Grenache, is that it can show you so many different variations on that theme that this was just a lovable thing for me to see this wine, to be able to do that. The thing which is also interesting for me in this wine, and Grenache can do this, is it can have that sort of saltpeter, charcuterie kind of element to it as well. And I saw that here in this wine as well. And and again, that's just another layer that you see in Grenache that provides that extra interest. It's just a much more open and transparent wine in a way than other bigger, sort of traditional red varieties. And that's why I think people are liking it. It's very drinkable, but it's also, you can actually contemplate this wine and spend a bit of time with it and see different elements come out. And I just think that's so much to see. But it's we're so used to aromatics being at the front of the wine, and I just noted that aromatics stayed all the way through this wine, right through to the finish. They're part of the flavour profile, but they just swirled all the way through, and I just love it. I'm a big fan of it.
Shanteh, I bet you can see this on the table.
100%. And I love Grenache, and we all do, I suppose, at the moment. But the Grenache in this country at the moment is probably, I think, one of the stars of late. Maybe in the last couple of years, maybe I'm just joining it a bit late. But I'm glad that Tony mentioned charcuterie, because along with the alluring elements of all that beautiful fruit, red, black, maybe hints of violets, I saw a lot of spices, in particular kind of savory spices like paprika and kind of cumin right towards the end, which it really took me to somewhere like Marrakesh or those kind of market elements, which then led me down the path of what you want to serve it with. And I think you have so much acidity here to cut through richer elements as well, but it just opens it up for thinking about what could you be eating with it. And I'd probably say with this particular Grenache, I actually didn't have a Pinot glass on hand at the time, and I used a Chardonnay glass. I had it in a few different glassware. I definitely say give it a little bit more air and pop it in a glass that's really going to open it up, and you get a lot of different elements coming through with that.
I think one thing that really impresses me with this wine is I think there aren't that many bigger brands doing Grenache particularly well. I think people have worked out how to do Chardonnay, and they've worked out how to do Shiraz and Cabernet. I think this is a really great sign for what Orlando's doing, in that this wine really has been really well made. It's been sensitively made. It's got character, and someone's tried really hard to make a good wine out of it and push the boat out a bit. And I don't see that in many of the bigger brands when it comes to Grenache. I see a lot of quite simple fleshy wines, whereas I think this is clearly quite different from that. Nice work, Ben.
Yeah.
We also have now the Prince Shed Northern Barossa Shiraz from 2018. Ben, you were talking about the difference between the north and the south. What does the northern bring? What does Northern Barossa bring?
I find that that it really pushes towards the darker fruits. So it's definitely got the plum, the dark cherry, the blackberry, all those sort of flavors. But I find, for me, the real difference is on the palate with the tannin profile. It's really sweet tannin. It's round, it's full, it's juicy. It's fun, I guess, is one of the things about the Northern Barossa for me. Maybe missing some of the more complex and spicy notes that you see, pepper notes that you see down south, but it still can make some stunning wines, and really nice to drink now.
People are going to love this, don't you think, Jeni?
Oh, yes. Again, if we put in a wine show, I think this could be another wine that divides a panel, which you may care to talk about later on, Ben. But I think the fruit is big, let's face it. Doesn't get much bigger than Northern Barossa Shiraz. So you've got really massive, sumptuous kind of layers of chocolate and blackberry and licorice. And then comes the cedar, and then comes the oak. And I think it's in keeping with the style, because there is so much meaty savouriness to that wine, and an enduring spice and sweet fruit. But the one thing I would have had some concern about is the oak. But again, when you have that much fruit, you have to do something, don't you, in the way of keeping the oak up to it as a supporting role. So how do you do that, Ben? Because it's always there in that wine.
Yeah, we've gone for a combination of both French and a reasonable dash of American oak in this, and there's quite a lot of new oak in it as well. I think again, for all these wines, they come down to barrel selection, at blending and looking at what works and what doesn't, and making a blend on the bench with every barrel in a measuring cylinder and tasting it, just adding a bit more new oak here or there, or taking some out. And we just found with that fruit, it just needed the oak and wanted the oak, and it really soaked it up, and it just gave us. I agree with you with your comment. Some people will look at that in the lineup in a wine show and go, they might say too much oak, but I think your average person drinking that at a restaurant or with dinner will probably say, that really stands up against whatever food I'm having right now, and I think a lot of us really like a bit of oak, and it's there.
And importantly, Ben, that's who you're making wines for. You're not making wines for wine show judges.
Exactly.
Tony?
I found this. I'm interested hearing about Jeni's interpretation of this wine, and because you expect big, muscly black fruits out of the northern Barossa. We all do that, and I understand that completely. And yes, the oak is here as well. My tasting of this surprised me, because I found that there was quite a surprising freshness for all that muscle that you might expect. I noted much more red crimson-y side of fruits than I expected. Yes, you get that spectrum between red, crimson and black, but I was quite surprised at the freshness of the fruit. Given everything else that was going on, there was still a freshness in the fruit and a vitality in the fruit. And I felt it was just a little bit toned. It was just really nicely toned northern Barossa than just going for heavyweight. And I found that to be quite an interesting take on, maybe, as you say, trying to find a slightly more modern style out of some of these traditional areas. But that was my impression of that wine. And I kind of found it really lovely to drink, because I quite often, those big northern Barossa, Shiraz, they're knife and fork stuff. You need to really kind of plough your way through it. And yes, it's chewy, and I noted the tannins were a sticky tannin rather than a big heavy tannin. I liked it. I liked it a lot, for all those reasons.
Shanteh, this would be a pretty easy sell, I imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I don't want to keep harping on. Yes, there's oak there. Yes, it's big and bold. Again, I didn't think that the fruit was overripe. I thought the fruit was nicely ripe, but for me, it was all about the tannins on that wine, and it's what kept making me come back and have another look at it. They were so I put them as, rather than sticky, as lithe and dusty, and just so well worked into it. The really lovely kind of fruit and skin tannins in there, and for me, that was a really, really redeeming feature, despite the fact there was so much oak. It made me want to go back because of those interesting and well-worked tannins.
And what kind of dish would you put with this?
Oh, God, I was thinking, you want some meat, don't you? You want something a bit bloody, in my opinion. I want something medium rare, maybe some black garlic, some big, bold flavours, yeah.
So the last wine for us to talk about it's a very interesting wine, because at this price point, you don't often get 6-year-old Barossa Cabernet. So this is essentially the Orlando Bungalow Lane Barossa Cabernet from 2014. So Ben, where do you find this kind of wine?
Where do you find the grapes, or where do we find the wine itself?
Where do you find the wine?
Yeah, so we've been making this wine for obviously quite a while, and we find that this particular style that we're making, we're going for a big, dark, I think we use the word brooding on this wine, Cabernet. It's very, very Barossan, so don't even think about comparing it to a nice, elegant Coonawarra Cabernet, because it's got dark chocolate, it's got dark fruits, it's big, it's bold, it's got a little bit of American oak in there, funnily enough. And it's one of those wines that needs a bit of time to settle down in the bottle before it's drinking really well. And so, it's 6 years of age. That's when we've decided to release it. And yeah, we just think it's really hitting its straps now, and it's about time to get it out into the market.
Tony, Barossa Cabernet, obviously.
Barossa Cabernet, and you need a good year. You need the perfect year, and 2014 was a pretty special year for Barossa Cabernet. You've been able to find the gold there, which I think is pretty good. Again, it's really dense. It's a big, beautiful cuddly kind of, Barossa Cabernet in a sense. I love all those herbal spice elements, just enough of that sort of herbal to show that it is Cabernet fruit without being over demanding and over dominating. So again, faint mint, faint dark chocolate. And again, the tannins were there as you'd expect in Cabernet, but they've just found a nice kind of rounded graininess to them, which just delivers that wine as it goes down through your palate and as you're drinking it. So, I'm looking at my notes, and with 6 years on now, it's found a sort of point of grace in that wine rather than it's just the right time. Where it is now is just a really lovely point to start with it. And I really liked it. I'm not necessarily a huge, Barossa Cabernet sort of a specialist and fan on every year, but this one really, rocked my boat. Loved it.
And it's good to see that cedary cigar boxy age character. And I think Tony said it beautifully. It's still got the brightness of freshness of fruit, but then there's also the age making this it's the right time for this. Would you agree with that, Jeni?
Yes. I saw 2014 on the label and my eyes lit up. So again, it's been a theme, hasn't it, about expectation. With so many of these wines, you see something, whoa, okay, 2014, let's see what this one can deliver. And I'd like to actually comment on the fact that we don't see enough aged wines released in Australia. We see them way too young. This was the way it used to be back in the 70s and 80s. You'd get Australian red wines released with at least 6 years of age. And because of various tax rules and things, it all changed. And we have had decades and decades of young Australian reds drunk way before their time. And here is a wine that is celebrating it's not necessarily its best, because clearly it still has a way to go. But I thought, yes, please, can we have more of this, please? And the balance. So one thing all of my notes talk about is just balance. Nothing's sticking out, nothing's too obvious. It's just a beautiful piece of winemaking of fruit, oak and tannin and structure. Again, you want a certain degree of structure with Cabernet Sauvignon. You certainly want that when it's coming from the Barossa Valley, I think, because you're thinking maybe it's going to be a warmer Cabernet. It's all there. The structure is so important, and that's what's keeping that wine going and will continue to go. So my hearty congratulations. I just think seeing a 6-year-old wine for what, $35? Yep. Yes, please.
I totally agree with all the things you just said. I thought the same thing. I thought Barossa Cabernet, okay, holy dooly, 2014, oh, it delivers, and it's $35. That is an excuse for anybody to purchase 6 or 12 bottles at that price point.
Yeah. So there we have the new heroes, $35 a bottle. And I think, as a roundup, I just think, there's lovely generosity of fruit in those wines. They've all got personality. They all speak of where they come from. They speak of varietal character. They speak of good winemaking, and they're just good drinks. Tony, what do you think?
Yeah, everything he said. It is like that. These wines have all got their individual, grace and beauty about them. They don't feel like they've been, factory made in a sense. They're all beautifully constructed, fruit, sensitive, place sensitive, all those things that make wines why we love wine, and I think that's all these are great. And as Shanteh said, $35 for a 6-year-old Barossa Cabernet, for a beautiful drinking Chardonnay. These are really, really well made wines and really lovely to drink, and I'm totally impressed. Yeah, lovely.
Ben, I think really fair play to you, because you've got these old school or older school styles, let's call them, with a history that you need to respect and reflect in some ways. And then on the same time, on the other side, you've got these vibrant, more youthful styles, which I think it's an incredible challenge for a winemaker to, because it's different sides, you know, really of the equation, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I think you've summed it up. We've got to pay respect to those older wines. The people have been drinking them for a long time and know what they want. We've got to respect that, but we've also got to, I guess, you know, stay relevant and create wines that are you know, more of the moment and that maybe the younger consumers are enjoying. So and hopefully, you know, recruit them in and get them to be a big Orlando fans into the future and enjoy some of those more classic Orlando styles as well.
And Shanteh, your kind of final thoughts on the legends and the new heroes, how they sit for you?
Yeah, well done to Ben. I think, you know, so often a new range comes out and people are experimenting, but they have no soul of the place where they come from. And the new heroes range really is testament to the style and the legacy of Orlando wines, but being updated and accessible. So I think that the wines side by side, both styles make a lot of sense to one another, and that's testament to the consideration that they've put into those wines. So well done.
And Jeni, we'll leave the last words to you. Your thoughts about today, about all the wines, the new heroes. What's the future of Orlando looking like for you?
Can I say, for someone who has strong memories of Orlando, I really appreciate the reflection back as well as forward. Not many companies do that. They're always looking forward. Very few work on their traditions. And I particularly love seeing the Orlando font. That is so reassuring to someone like me. You go, yes. Just seeing the font on a label kind of can bring it back. Keeping the green label, which we haven't talked about yet, the importance. I really liked the way the marketing department actually stood back a bit. They didn't let marketing take it all over, and we have seen that sometimes in the past. I just like the way Ben clearly stood up for himself and the winemaking and the history, and you are the one going forward, not necessarily all the fancy marketing about it. I love the simplicity of this, and that would be the way I saw it, that you're looking to the past as well as the future. Well done.
Beautiful words, Jeni. Absolutely appropriate for us to sign off from here. So I want to thank you all, obviously, for joining us today. Ben Thoman, Chief Winemaker at Orlando, Jeni Port from Melbourne, Tony Love from Adelaide, Shantae Wong from Sydney and Key Restaurant. Thanks all for joining us. We look forward to tasting the next vintage, Ben, to be honest.
Thanks for having me. It's been a lot of fun, and yeah, I look forward to making them.